Okay, great. So today, we're going to be talking about the history and market of electric vehicles. Yeah, if you guys are coming in the last couple of minutes, make sure to fill out the poll for your participation points. Not a quiz, just the poll. Yeah, and we'll see how well you guys did on this little poll here. Okay, one sec, let me get oriented. All right, so first off, for everyone who said the first electric vehicle was in the 1800s, you are correct. So the first EV came out in 1828, Anios Jedlik, and it was actually a fairly popular vehicle in a relative sense back in the 1800s. So these guys were actually around before the first gasoline car came out, which didn't happen until the 1870s. That's called the Marcus car. So how come we weren't all driving in electric vehicles back in the 1900s? What happened? Yeah, money, but what about money? Yeah, so economics, obviously, it plays a really important role here. Does anyone know what the first sort of production assembly line vehicle was? Model T, exactly. The Model T came out in the early 1900s, and a lot of the sort of innovation behind that sort of vehicle helped propel that technology past what electric vehicles were capable of at the time. And still today, right, one of the biggest benefits of fossil fuel cars is that it is able to use this really energy dense transportable resource, right? Gasoline, or diesel fuel. Whereas electric vehicles, you have some technological hurdles to overcome. And so these guys definitely died out in the sort of late 1800s. Okay, what's the first sort of, we'll say, quote unquote, modern electric vehicle? Does anyone know? The smart car. So, okay, smart cars. So if we remember back to the first lecture, those are actually not electric vehicles. Those would be, most of them are actually just regular gas cars. There are versions of smart cars that are hybrids, but they don't operate on just a sort of battery pack. Yeah. EV1, yes. So this might be ancient history for most folks, but General Motors actually produced the very first electric vehicle back in the 90s. So we're gonna, like I said in last class, we'll talk about some of the policy stuff and regulations that ended up pushing these forward. But you can, for now, I'll just say this is kind of the product of one of California's really big regulations, the zero emissions vehicle regulation, which back in the 90s wasn't really forcing automakers to produce electric vehicles in the way they are today, but still started to motivate some automakers to produce these things. So the first version of these guys use lead acid batteries. So if you open up the sort of hood of your regular gas car, you will find a big, heavy sort of lead acid battery. And that's usually used to power, the minor electronics and electronic components in your car. But for these vehicles, they basically took a whole bunch of these lead acid batteries together to be able to power the drivetrain. anyone ever picked up a lead acid battery? Yeah, they're pretty heavy, right? And so the amount of batteries that you would need to power these guys adds an extraordinary amount of weight. So it does reduce the efficiency. If we see here, the earliest versions had about 16 to 19 kilowatt hours of lead acid batteries, which is actually a pretty substantial amount even today. So as a point of comparison, right, Teslas usually have around, let's say, between 70 to 100 kilowatt hours. So a couple times smaller, but for back then, that's a lot of batteries to be using. Later on, they switched to nickel metal hydride batteries, which are a little bit more energy dense. And so they were able to get up to 26.4 kilowatt hours. So even breaking the 100-mile barrier. We're going to talk a little bit more in detail about battery chemistries on our battery lecture, but nickel metal hydride is the sort of next precursor, to lithium ion batteries. These guys are used in hybrid vehicles. So the Toyota Prius famously was one of the original vehicles that really took advantage of and developed this nickel metal hydride technology. So you'll note that it was a pretty short stint, 1996 to 1999. You couldn't actually buy these guys, you had to lease them, which is kind of a long-term rental, essentially. And you return the vehicles back to the automaker after the lease period, which is usually 2 or 3 years. And for the average car, if you bought a gas car and if you lease a gas car instead of buying it and you return it to the dealership, there's usually a couple things can happen. Either you have the option to buy it outright from the dealership at sort of a discounted price, right? You're kind of like buying a used car after you've used it. Or they'll take that car and sell it on the used market. But for a lot of the new technologies, even today for like hydrogen vehicles, this is happening. Back then, the EV1, GM would take the car back and then they would actually destroy them. And a lot of people kind of conspiracy theory think it was like a self-sabotage way of basically saying the electric car is not going to be a successful technology. And there's this huge sort of interesting documentary for those who are interested called "Who Killed the Electric Car?" Yeah, if folks want to watch that in their own time. And there's a sort of follow-on documentary called "Revenge of the Electric Car," which gets into all of these details. Okay, and so Revenge of the Electric Car. So the sort of first commercial vehicle available in sort of the most recent continuous generation is the Tesla Roadster. So the first generation was first released to the public in 2008. And this is the first electric vehicle also to use lithium ion batteries, going all the way up to 53 kilowatt hours. So this isn't exactly a widely available, large scale sort of commercial model, right? This is a pretty high-end luxury vehicle. The other one that was released in the same time period was the Fisker Karma, also sort of a high-end sports car. But what we would really consider the first widely available commercial electric vehicle for your average consumer were these two vehicles. So this top one is the Chevy Volt, which is a plug-in hybrid, and the bottom one is the Nissan Leaf. And these were both released at about the same time in December of 2010/January of 2011. So this is our first kind of flagship for plug-in hybrids. It had a 40-mile range vehicle before it switches to gas. And then the Nissan Leaf was an 80-mile range vehicle. The Leaf kind of continuously got upgraded. And so the battery sizes over the years got bigger and bigger. So for a typical vehicle cycle, like a production cycle, a particular model will usually goes around 5 to 6 years production cycle. So for example, if you think about like a Honda Civic and you think about the look of a Honda Civic from year to year, it doesn't really change that much. And then suddenly one year it'll get this like big upgrade, right? You think about like the generations of these vehicles. So that cycle is known as this vehicle production cycle, which lasts 5 to 6 years. And usually vehicles don't change too much within that production cycle, but for the Nissan Leaf, there were sort of continuous year-on-year upgrades to its battery and battery management system after it was released. Yeah, unique thing about the Chevy Volt, again, this is something we'll talk about in a later lecture, but the first instantiation had a 16 kilowatt hour battery to go 40 miles. And if you were to buy, actually even today, if you go to buy an electric car, you can get up to $7,500 back from the federal government on tax credit. And that is dependent on the size of the battery. And in order to get the full amount, you have to buy a car that has at least 16 kilowatt hours, which lines up perfectly with the Chevy Volt. So that's not really a coincidence there, right? This is where some of the automakers can influence the policy decisions and the way incentives and other policies are structured. Okay, any questions about these guys? Great. Okay, so what has the market looked like in the US since 2011? Pretty steady growth over the last decade. So this graph here shows you the quarterly sales of electric vehicles across the entire country. And then in the red, you have, so the red and the green on the secondary y-axis tells you the cumulative sales of electric vehicles over the last decade or so. We can see here, the green line, which is California, is about half of the rest of the United States. So California is responsible for 50% of electric vehicles being sold within this country. And again, we'll talk about reasons for why that is, especially related to regulation. But a lot of automakers are sort of focusing their market efforts within the state. It's growing in pretty quickly in other states as well, but California is definitely sort of on the frontier and usually gets, I'd say, first pick of the litter when it comes to new electric vehicle models coming out. Yeah, for reference, right? Okay, in terms of market share, the US sells about 16 million vehicles every year, and California sells about 1 million vehicles every year. So if we look at these numbers, right? So California, their sales in 2021 was 187,000. Okay, wait, so I have my numbers wrong. So I know that California last year sold about a little more than 10%. So actually California's annual sales are maybe closer to 2 million. And national sales in 2021 was about 500,000 out of 16 million. So from a market share perspective, still quite a bit smaller, but still growing. Yeah, the 2019 time period was pretty interesting. If you were in the sort of realm of electric vehicles, there was a lot of concern at that time because we started seeing sales flattening out. And so there was this sort of clamor about how electric vehicles had kind of plateaued already. But 2020 and 2021 quickly kind of disproved that. Actually, this year, 2021 has tripled the number of sales in 2019 and doubled the number of sales in 2020. So still lots of good progress for EVs. Yeah, I'll show that here. So you can see really big growth in the 2021 time period. This is broken down by automakers here, and we'll go into a little bit more detail on a different, actually the next slide. Okay, so breaking down sales by vehicle model. As I was talking about at the very beginning, your first guys in 2011 are going to be Nissan for your battery electrics here. On the left, it's all full battery electrics. On the right, it's plug-in hybrids. And blue here is that Chevy Volt. And you can see if we go through about the 2015-ish, 2016 time period, there's a sort of fairly even split between Teslas, which were selling only the Model S at the time. They were also selling Roadsters, but really sort of low volume. So you've got Tesla Model S, Nissan Leaf, and Chevy Volt, all pretty evenly dominating the vehicle market. You'll see that there are some like small slivers of other guys getting sold. And that is actually more a product of some of the regulations that I was mentioning. So these regulations essentially require automakers, if you sell cars in California, then a certain percentage of those cars have to be electric vehicles, right? And so we kind of distinguish the vehicles that they sell into two categories, sort of commercially viable vehicles, which they're trying to sell on the mass market. And those would be like your Nissan Leafs, your Chevy Volts, and your Teslas. And then you have what are known as compliance vehicles. So these vehicles are being produced by the automakers just to comply with the policy. And those vehicles tend to be, I don't want to say more experimental, but they're not produced in such a way that they want to be selling them at high volumes. And so oftentimes you'll see like, hey, this automaker needs to sell, 300 electric vehicles, and they'll sell basically almost exactly 300. And so it's pretty easy to tell when you look back at the data, which of these vehicles are sort of compliance vehicles. And these days, most of the automakers are now shifting towards sort of commercially viable options and sort of more mass market options. And the ones who were trying to do that at the beginning are arguably sort of ahead of the curve, right? They've had more years to kind of develop this in sort of mass produced production lines. When we start moving out to, okay, this particular year right here, 2017, there's a really big jump, and this whole bar here is pink. That's all Tesla. Okay, and so today, if you add up all the sales of electric cars by all automakers not called Tesla, they would sell about a third of what Tesla is selling. So Tesla accounts right now for about 75% of the EV market. And the volumes that they're selling at aren't just like these niche sort of technology volumes, right? These are sort of competing with your Honda Civics, Toyota Corollas. The volumes are meant to be sort of wide-reaching towards the mass market. And for a long period of time, we saw a pretty even split between full battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids until the Model 3 came out. And then it's all fully electric, right? Because they were so dominant in the market. All right, any questions about this? Yeah. It's pretty common, right, to see Teslas out and about every day. You're on the road, and there are lots of other electric vehicles out on the road. It maybe it's harder to kind of notice them because they look very similar to other vehicles. But to get back to, I think, our polling question about the availability of vehicle models. So as of today, the answer for that was more than 50. Okay, so there's often, I found that it's a big area of misconception. There are a lot more vehicle models available on electric drivetrains than most people think. Is anyone on the market for a car these days? No, no one. Yeah, okay, so if you were, it would be difficult. There are these pretty big supply shortages. So I don't know how much people have heard about this, but during the sort of early stages of the pandemic, a bunch of automakers canceled orders for semiconductors. So a lot of these semiconductors are necessary for chips that are used in like electronic chips used in the vehicle. But unfortunately, as the economies around the world have recovered, automakers have not really been able to get access to those semiconductors again, because when they canceled the orders, a lot of that stuff was reallocated to other sort of end uses for consumer electronics. And because of that, a lot of automakers, OEMs, have essentially stopped producing or limited a lot of the production of new vehicles. So if you're driving around and you see dealerships, you'll often notice that the lots are a lot more empty. And oftentimes you'll see this type of thing. Market price adjustment, $10,000. So you're gonna have to pay, you know, 10K more for your average vehicle. And this isn't unique to electric cars. This is for like any car. Yeah, it's very difficult to buy a new car these days, which coincidentally has also driven used car prices up right now. Yeah, we're actually thinking of I'm actually thinking of selling my used car for basically the same price that I got it. So it was like a 4 or 5 year free rental, essentially. Yeah, and the shortages are probably going to last for still quite a while. Yeah, some experts predict that this won't end until 2023. So if you can hold off on buying a car, I would recommend not paying $10,000 more than the MSRP. All right. So electric vehicles by segment and class. Yeah, I include this because a lot of what we think about when it comes to sort of technology adoption, it's not just that like people want to care about this new technology or are interested in sort of electric vehicles. That'll drive some people's decision making. But the more access and availability that you have to different sort of vehicle classes, the more likely that people will purchase these vehicles, right? The use cases for, let's say your typical suburban like soccer mom who needs a minivan, right? There aren't really that many options for that these days. There's the like Chrysler Pacifica. But as more and more vehicles come out, then you'll see a more sort of accelerated growth in people adopting these vehicles because vehicles within the classes that they're interested in are starting to become more available. So the earliest electric vehicles trend to be in smaller segments. Does anyone know why that is?
What do you mean by smaller segments?
So like, so thinking about like a, yeah, the size of the car, like mini compacts, subcompact, these sedans, right? They didn't start out in F-150s, right? Why is that? Yeah, lighter, exactly. So there is, so again, this is a topic we'll talk about later, but there's a fundamental trade-off in battery technology between energy density and power density. So energy density is what gives you the ability to go long ranges, right? The more energy I have, the farther I can go. Power density gives you the ability to move objects that are heavier, okay? And so if you wanted to just stick a bunch of batteries into like a Ford F-150 to give it a bunch of range, there might not be enough power, right, as you add more and more weight to it to actually propel the vehicle in ways that people drive today, right? And so as these vehicles come out in smaller segments, the technology will start to improve both in sort of the battery itself, incremental improvements in both energy density and power density, improvements in the drivetrain, in the motors that are being used, in the controllers, and even in the like temperature management systems. All of these things are going to help make it possible to go into larger and larger segments. And so that's why now we're starting to see battery electric vehicles starting to penetrate into even pickup trucks, right? And so there's the Rivian R1T, the Cybertruck, the Ford F-150 Lightning. These are all going to be coming out within the next, actually even next year or two. And so we're starting to see more pervasive availability within these larger segments. Yes. Yep. So it affects all vehicles because those chips are needed for everyone. But one interesting thing about this is now I'm an automaker, right? And I have to limit my production, which means I now have to make a choice about what kind of vehicles I want to produce, okay? And when we look at the data, everyone gets produced less, but proportionally, a lot of automakers are actually choosing to relatively produce more electric vehicles. And maybe that has to do with the premiums associated with them, but it is kind of a promising sign that like, right, when push comes to shove, and there are these production shortages that they are producing, they are still producing electric vehicles. Okay, so as I was mentioning, there are lots of kind of interesting trends happening in the space for battery technology. And one of the things that we're consistently seeing are an upwards trend in the range of electric vehicles due to increasing battery sizes for these vehicles as well. I had mentioned, right, for the Nissan Leaf, originally it had a 24 kilowatt hour battery with a 73-mile range. And over time, they would sort of gradually increase that. In the next production cycle upgrade, the Nissan Leaf was upgraded up to 40 kilowatt hours at 150 miles, so double its range. And actually, even today, there are now options to get I believe a 60 kilowatt hour battery at about 220-mile range for the Nissan Leaf. And so you can see this reflected in a variety of vehicle models. So the Chevy Volt here, before it was canceled, right? So 16 kilowatt hour for 35-mile range. And the newer version of it back in 2016 time period was released, went up to 18.4 kilowatt hours to 50 miles. Same type of thing. The first Prius prototype plug-in hybrid went from 14-mile range, doubled up to 25 miles. And then more generally for the sort of full-size vehicles, the longest range that had been available besides Tesla was the Chevy Bolt, which is 60 kilowatt hours, 240-mile range. And now that's pretty much the standard. That's actually considered, I would say, even on the low end for a lot of the sort of modern day full-size battery electric vehicles. Usually, most automakers are aiming for 250 to 300, 310 miles of range. Yeah, this isn't like a comprehensive list of all the vehicles. And actually nowadays, a lot of vehicles have multiple configurations. I can buy a standard range and an extended range option. So they'll put more batteries in, so you have a longer range. This guy's pretty cool. Lucid Air came out last year. Currently the longest range vehicle on the market. It's got a 113 kilowatt hour battery and it can go 520 miles. Yeah, and so that's like maybe 30%, 50% more than even some of the longest range vehicles. But it is pretty expensive. So. Any questions about anything so far? So this is kind of a more quantitative way of looking at some of this. If you do a sales weighted average in the range and battery size, we can see what some of the trends are doing, or what trends are happening over time. And you can see here, right? So plug-in hybrids have tended to stay relatively flat. So on the left side is the range, on the right side is the battery size. But for full battery electrics, we've started out on average sort of down here at about 25 kilowatt hours, and now the average looks more like 80 kilowatt hours, right? And that range corresponds to something like 80 miles and now over 300 miles on average. Yeah, it's funny, the director of my research center looked at this slide and he was like, well, that's kind of silly. You're just showing the Teslas, which is pretty much true, right? Because Teslas are selling most of the cars. So you're getting averaged against a huge number of Teslas. So obviously it's going to go up. And you can see, right, that does kind of track, right? So 2016, so all of this increase was like right after the Model 3 came out. So yeah, you know, Tesla's driving a lot of this, but still, even in a non-sales weighted graph, you do see vehicle battery sizes and ranges increasing. A quick breakdown of this Tesla dominance. So right here, you can see everyone else. in the red versus Tesla. And then the breakdown by the different models over here. So at the beginning, Roadster is here, but it's very low volume. It's not even going to really show up on the graph. And then the two really big ones in the red and teal are your Model 3 and your Model Y, which are sort of designed to be more more of the sort of mass market consumer friendly, as opposed to the Model S, which is still kind of a high-end, more luxury vehicle. Oh yeah, forgot to mention this. So this other is like a data thing where they weren't able to distinguish between which models were getting sold. But most of these in the latter periods are probably going to be your Model 3s and Model Ys. It can be tricky to get data from Tesla sometimes. Okay. So while Tesla, they're already at 100% electric vehicles, right? All these other automakers are starting to shift gears to move in that direction. Okay. And so here, what I've done, I went through basically all the sort of various pledges and announcements that automakers have made. And this is probably already outdated. There were a couple announcements last week and the week before about commitments and targets. So 3 sort of different types of pledges that automakers have been making. So specific EV targets, so some proportion of the vehicles that they're producing, they think are going to be electric. So up here, we can see how these pledges kind of look. So these are percentages. So by 2030, for example, BMW says 50% of all the cars that they make are going to be electric. And down here are some sort of volumetric ones as well. So by 2025, they're saying they're going to make 2 million electric vehicles. And so we can see kind of how these targets shape up in terms of timeline and compared to each other. There is some criticism for these EV targets that, like, if an automaker makes some kind of announcement, it's not really binding, and they could be technically saying, telling you the truth, but sometimes, there's some suspicion that, okay, maybe they just mean hybrid vehicles, right, which aren't really electric, as we talked about before. We don't know if the automakers consider that to be part of any of these pledges. Yeah.
So looking at the graph on 2020 Honda in Europe.
Yep.
So that it's saying that ideally right now, almost all the production for all cars in Europe from Honda are no longer.
Yeah, that's right.
But is that true, or is that just a target that?
I actually don't know. I should look into that. Honda doesn't sell that many cars in Europe compared to some of the other automakers. But yeah, at some point they made an announcement that at least in Europe that they'll do 100%. Yeah. And again, like that could be like inclusive of hybrids. So maybe they're counting that towards their goal. But for whatever skepticism that one might have, it's good that a lot of these automakers are making pledges of some kind, right? Well, good in the sense that, if you're for electric vehicles. The other one, some people think this is a sort of better indicator, is how much money that these companies are dedicating to either R&D or production and manufacturing of electric vehicles. And these are not small sums of money, right? These are tens of billions of dollars. So that represents a really sort of substantial commitment by a lot of these automakers going into this technology. There's also carbon neutrality, which means, which really could mean anything, to be honest. But they are pledging, that the vehicles here are going to be carbon neutral, right, by some amount of time. And we'll get a lot more into issues of emissions and carbon neutrality when we start talking about electric vehicles and the grid and that sort of thing. That'll come in a couple weeks. Any other questions about what automakers are doing? All right. Lots happening these days, and there's a lot sort of coming up. This was, I just went in and looked up like, what are the next set of electric vehicles that are coming out, right? And here's just a subset of them across. And one of the things you'll notice is that again, across a wide variety of vehicle classes. In particular, a lot of these SUVs or compact SUVs, those actually are the most popular vehicle segment in the United States right now. And so as the technology starts to penetrate into that particular segment of vehicles, yeah, I suspect that sales of these technologies will really take off. Yeah, I think compact SUVs account for something like half of all vehicles sold in the US now. All right. So we're at 6 o'clock. Why don't we take a quick 5-minute break? I'll pause the recording. Okay, so lots of promising stuff happening in the market. California, okay. Yeah, so market share wise, US is about 3%, California is about 10%. And as I mentioned, California sells about half of the EVs in the US over the last decade. And a lot of that has to do with the regulatory policies here. And if we want to do a sort of more detailed breakdown, here we can see the sort of volume of electric vehicles being sold in California versus other states as of the end of 2020. The sales in California are actually, or sorry, these are registration. This comes from registration data. And the registrations are actually a little bit lower in California compared to the sales. And that has to do with the fact that you can have sort of cross-state commerce happening. Some people will buy vehicles in California and then drive them out to other states. So that is a not a super common occurrence, but does account for some of those differences. And you can see, yes, this is kind of correlated to population, but really disproportionately so for California, right? They really have a lot of sales. Well, and one thing that I'll note here is that doesn't necessarily indicate like a lack of interest or demand in other states, right? So if I'm out in like Texas, for example, and I want to go buy an electric vehicle, but I go to the dealership and there's just no electric vehicles on the lot, and I would have to wait 6 months to buy one, right? That's going to dissuade a lot of people from purchasing electric vehicles. So this is also has to do with the way automakers are supplying vehicles to these states as much as the sort of latent demand for this technology in a lot of these areas. Back in the 2017, 2018 time period, we were trying to look at sort of the market potential in the Northeast, having to do with some of the policy changes that were happening in California. And basically, a lot of the automakers would say, hey, you know, we don't want to sell any vehicles here because there's no demand. No one wants to buy them here, right? But when we go and visit a lot of these states, what we were finding is that dealerships just weren't offering any of that product. And that as soon as they did, if any EV would show up, it would get sold off the lot instantly, right? Which is a pretty good indicator that there is some kind of demand there. So take this kind of with a grain of salt. It's not just that only Californians want electric vehicles. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about electric vehicles in the US, right? But they are getting sold elsewhere in the world. Does anyone know what country sells the most EVs in terms of like a per capita, like a market share? Yeah, it is Norway. Yes. Yeah, so I haven't looked at this data in quite a while, but even back in like the 2016, 2017 time period, they were selling 40% of their vehicles were electric. And let's see, back in 2020, we're now talking about 75% of their vehicles are electric, right? That means 7 or 8 out of every 10 vehicles sold is an electric car. Yeah, so Norway is kind of the big case study country that everyone wants to study, at least in the sort of academic realm. Why is Norway doing so well with their electric vehicle sales? Yeah, does anyone want to venture to guess? Yes.
Really high gas prices. Also, they have good.
Yeah, so they do have high gas prices, especially relative to the US, even considering today's, but not compared to the rest of Europe. So then if that were the case, you know, why isn't the rest of Europe also selling lots of EVs? Anyone else? Yes. They do have a lot of renewable energy. So the country of Norway is predominantly powered through hydro, but their electricity isn't necessarily way cheaper than a lot of other places. Oh yeah, all right, more guesses. They do, but if you know, with that argument, there's this kind of fundamental question, like which one came first, right? Is it like, do they develop a lot of infrastructure because they're selling lots of electric vehicles, or the other way around? It kind of goes hand in hand, I would say, yeah. Yes, that is, yes, that's, I would argue that is the main reason. And it's not even, I'm gonna sort of caveat that, incentives. Let me kind of describe that. Okay, so if you guys, okay, forget the sort of chip shortage and all that. Let's say you go out to buy a car right now, and you are deciding between, let's say, let's say you're deciding between buying a Honda Civic, like a sort of nicer end one, maybe a $25,000 Honda Civic, versus, let's say, what's a decent EV these days? Let's say the like Chevy Bolt or something, which MSRP might be like 41, 42, but you get 10K incentives back. So let's say let's say it's like $32,000 to $33,000. All right, raise your hand if you would get the Honda Civic. And then, okay, a couple people here, and then raise your hand if you would get the Chevy Bolt, right? So there's some mixed responses. All right, so let me reorient this question. So what if it were what if it were 35K for the Honda Civic and 32K for the Chevy Bolt? Which one would you buy? Would the people who bought Civics still get the Civics? No. Yeah, so the reason why I think it's like this is because Norway has these extremely aggressive import policies for fossil fuel vehicles. Well, just for cars in general. And so there's this markup value added tax. If I buy any vehicle in Norway, that could be 30–50% of the value of the vehicle. It actually depends on a lot of things, on the efficiency, the size of the engine, size of the car, and all that. But it could double the price of the vehicle. So buying a car is just inherently really expensive in Norway. But if you buy an electric car, you're not subject to any of the value added taxes. So it's kind of like an incentive, right? Because you get to bypass all these taxes. And essentially what you end up seeing is that one of the big case studies that was done was that you could look at the Volkswagen Golf, which is offered as a gas car, a diesel car, a plug-in hybrid, and a full electric vehicle. And the electric vehicle was the cheapest out of all of them, and it sold the most. So Norway's success in this realm is, again, due to some of the sort of policies that they have in place. Personally, I think it's a little silly when researchers ask this question of like, oh, like how can we replicate what Norway is doing in America? Well, we could like tax all the cars $20,000, all gas cars $20,000, but that's not going to happen, right? So, yeah, I think the US's ability to replicate this sort of thing is inherently pretty difficult. But it's a nice little way to show that like people care about saving money, right? And that's driving a lot of these sales beyond just people who care about electric vehicles. Okay, so the other poll question I had, who sells the most electric vehicles? Is it Europe? Is it the US? Or is it China? Or is it the rest of the world? It's China by a lot. And like not even close. So up until last year, China was selling the most by far. There are some new European policies that have really been pushing automakers to produce electric vehicles, and that's finally sort of come into fruition in 2021. So I don't have the sort of latest sales here, but now Europe is kind of matching what China is selling. China gets to be a little bit more aggressive with their regulation. So I've been mentioning this policy in California called the zero emissions vehicle mandate, again, right, which requires automakers to produce some number of electric vehicles for every car that they sell. UC Davis, actually, there is a big group here with a lot of sort of affiliations with Chinese government officials. We got some of those officials to come over here, sit down with the California Air Resources Board, which is the entity that regulates this policy that I was talking about. And so China sat down with ARB, a lot of sort of ministry officials, saw what we were doing, went back and made this like totally souped up version of the California policy that's like way more aggressive. And immediately after that happened in 2017, we saw a sort of big explosion in vehicle sales. One of the other things that China is able to take advantage of is that they can really quickly catch up to what all the other automakers are doing. And the reason for that is that if you are an automaker and you want to sell cars in China, you can only do that if you partner with a Chinese company. And when you do that, they get access to all of your patents, okay? And so every car company out there, GM, Ford, BMW, Mercedes, all these all the big car companies, they have a sort of sister company in China that is able to kind of use that technology and all the sort of developments that they're doing. And so you might think, why the heck would any automaker want to do that? Well, China's a pretty big market, and if you want in on that market, it's probably worth it, right, to do these things. So China really has rocketed ahead of the rest of the world in terms of electric vehicles being sold. All right, any questions? Okay. So most of what we've talked about are sales of new vehicles. But when we think about propagating this technology out to kind of the rest of the population, one thing that you need to keep in mind is that of people who buy cars, only about 35, okay, so of the entire population of eligible sort of buyers, only about 35% of that population buys new cars, okay? 2/3 of the population hasn't bought a new car in the last 5 years. And more than 1/4 of people who do purchase vehicles is going to be in the used vehicle market. And so the way that this technology is going to sort of penetrate into the rest of the population isn't through everyone buying a new electric car. Okay, it's going to sort of filter out through the used vehicle market. And so when we think about this from a policy perspective about getting an electric vehicle to every sort of household, at the beginning, it makes a lot of sense, right, to focus on the new car buyers. But nowadays, there's a lot of discussion through regulatory agencies, through the legislature, to think about how you can sort of incentivize folks in the used vehicle market to start buying electric vehicles. This is going to be a different segment of people, right? Like people who are more enthusiastic about buying electric vehicles tend to be the ones who want to buy new ones. And with used vehicles, people will have sort of recycled concerns about the technology, as well as possibly sort of legitimate concerns about things like battery degradation. Okay, someone's been driving around this car for a couple of years, like, is the battery still good? How much longer is it going to last me? And so these days, there's a lot of sort of on the academic side, there's a lot of research getting launched into kind of better understanding the used vehicle market, which unfortunately, you know, I don't have a lot of slides about it because like getting data about used vehicle transactions is a lot harder than getting data from like dealerships and auto associations about new vehicle sales, right? Like there isn't like a central repository of people tracking like Facebook sales of vehicles being sold, or like Craigslist, right? That's just kind of happening without a lot of good ability to track this. I mean, which isn't to say we can't do it, right? There are ways. You can look at vehicle registration data. You can see if vehicles are moving around, that sort of thing. But it's inherently harder than just looking at sales data. Yeah, and better understanding the like types of people who are getting involved in the used vehicle market is going to help develop policies, for example, to incentivize the sort of right things, right? So there's some discussions, for example, about guaranteeing that batteries have to be at a certain state of charge within a certain amount of time, otherwise they get a free replacement. So things like that to help provide more confidence in the used vehicle market. So this is a very active area of research right now. One of the other big ways that used vehicles are entering the market is through leases, right? So I had mentioned this sort of earlier, right? If you lease the vehicle, these like long 2 or 3 year term rentals, essentially, once that's over, those vehicles will then get introduced into the used vehicle market. And that's attractive. The sort of leasing model initially is going to be attractive for a lot of people who are maybe unsure of the technology. Maybe they want to try it out first for a set amount of time, you know, this 2 year time period before committing to it. So after they lease it, they can choose to buy it. Otherwise, it goes back to the used car market, and that's a great way to introduce the new technology into the used market as well, without sort of having to wait these sort of longer time periods. Here, this is a plot of sort of proportion of leases by different model types. And so the BMW i3, for example, was almost exclusively leased. I don't actually know why. That's like a really sort of high proportion compared to so all of these electric vehicles, the Ford C-Max Energy, the Chevy Bolt, and the Nissan Leaf here, you can see all of these guys are, you know, above 30%, all the way up to 80–90%, whereas the average car it usually is around 30%. So electric vehicles definitely have a disproportionately high number of leases compared to your regular gas cars. So regarding leases, there's this kind of interesting thing that happens. This is called a residual value. So this is after you lease the vehicle, how valuable is what is the value of the vehicle after the lease is up? This caused quite a controversy kind of earlier in the like mid 2010s in the way that people thought the value that electric vehicles retain their value. And it's a problem because the residual value is often this sort of proxy for how attractive the vehicle is, how much people value and demand that vehicle. And what a lot of people were pointing out is that EVs have this sort of artificially low residual value. And that's because, let's say the MSRP, the manufacturer's suggested retail price, that's what the automaker thinks the the car should sell for. Let's say for the Chevy Volt, you can buy that car for about $42,000. The problem is that the government gives this big incentive, this tax credit, and California gives you this tax rebate, right? So you buy the car for $42,000, but then you get $9,000 to $10,000 back, right? And so that incentive value gets reflected in the price of the residual value. And so if I compare the MSRP to the residual value, then you're saying for the Chevy Volt, that might be something as low as 46%, which means that after the lease, the car lost half of its value, right? And people will look at that and say, hey, this is a terrible car. Like no one should buy this car because it loses its value so quickly. But in reality, it's because the used price reflects the price after the incentive. So if you account for incentives, the average goes up to like 56%, even higher in some cases. And that's much more kind of in line with the average vehicle, where you'll tend to see something like a 60 to 70% residual value for their leases. Yeah, this is kind of like this interesting nuance that people were seeing. I think there's a better understanding and grasp of this now. But it's kind of speaking to all these like interesting territory that this new technology is getting into, and how that plays kind of a role in the way people view these vehicles. Yeah.
So you buy a car, you get access to benefits and incentives.
Not directly, but think of it this way. Let's say you buy a new car, it's like $40,000, you get $10K back. So effectively you bought it for $30K. If you, let's say the value of the vehicle goes down by like $5,000 and then you want to sell it, right? You sell it for the price after the incentives, not before the incentives, right? And why is that? So I bought it for 40, got 10K, I'm at 30. If I sell it for 35, which is off the original price, why would anyone do that? They just buy it new for 30, right? So you have to take into account the effective price. So you would sell it for 25. Otherwise, the new vehicle would undercut your price. So for the used car buyer, they capture the value of that incentive. It's like passed down to them essentially. But even beyond that, there is talk about like from the legislature, they've actually already proposed some bills that didn't go through, to give some incentive to used car buyers as well. So you buy it used and you get something more on top of that. So an even better deal. It's tricky. I'm undecided as to whether or not it's a good thing to do. I think it'd be tricky because there's a lot of ways you could game that, because the used vehicle market is a lot less straightforward. Yeah. Okay. So as we talk about, going from new to used to try and get to, broader and broader portions of the population. Again, for me, a lot of the motivation is from the sort of environmental standpoint and for like climate change reasons. And so really to decarbonize transportation, you need to get it into sort of everyone's hands, right? And so nowadays, in addition to the sort of used markets, the issues related to the used market, there's a lot of discussion about sort of equity and access, right? And so if all the electric vehicles these days are getting sold in the South Bay and like Palo Alto, San Jose, and it's just a bunch of, you know, millionaires driving around with these expensive electric vehicles, like how in the world will sort of lower income, disadvantaged communities have access to this technology, right? So the sort of burdens, the financial burdens can be particularly difficult for certain groups of people. And so some of the barriers, right? Higher upfront costs of vehicle purchase. So even if like an electric vehicle saves money over the lifetime of the vehicle, if you don't have access to the initial capital to purchase the vehicle in the first place, you don't have the ability to realize those savings, right? Okay, access to home charging infrastructure, that's a really big one. 85% of electric vehicle charging events happen at home. Okay, and so if I live in a single family detached home and I have a garage and I can, you know, upgrade my my break-in circuit and get 40 amps to my house and put a level 2 charger, great, no problem, right? But what if I live in an apartment and you don't have a garage? So there are other sorts of inherent barriers to even the types of places where you're living that could prevent you from sort of utilizing this sort of technology. Availability of vehicles in local dealerships. Okay, I was talking about this before in terms of like state to state variation, but even within California, maybe all the cars in like San Jose lots are electric, but if you go to like Bakersfield, maybe you're gonna have a lot smaller access. Maybe there won't be so many electric vehicles, right? So availability is an important issue too. And then generally, lack of knowledge and familiarity with new technology. So, you know, you might hang out in circles where people are talking about how cool electric cars are and how great the technology is. Someone else might be hanging out in circles where they say, like, I don't know how this works. Like, what about how long it takes to charge? What about all these range issues? Yeah.
So doing that leasing is one of the main ways that, at least right now,
Mhm.
leases are getting on the like used market. Is there any thinking about like policy or things to do to kind of encourage leasing for EVs?
Yeah, so what I would say is that so there already is, right? So the like federal tax credit can apply to leases as well. And it's not like exclusively special to leases, right? You get them if you buy it and you get it if you lease, but it can make the finances for leasing like extraordinarily good, right? There was some point, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, where there were a handful of vehicles where if you applied the credit to the lease, you could lease a vehicle for 2 to 3 years for like $30 a month, right? And so I don't think you need to do something special with leases. They're already sort of disproportionately higher. And I wouldn't say leases are the only way or even necessarily the dominant way that they're entering the used car market. One of the surprising things we've been finding in the research is that a lot of people who are buying electric vehicles are turning them over pretty quickly, even if they buy them outright. So like 4 to 5 years, they'll get rid of their EV and buy a new one. So a lot of that is happening as well. Okay. Who here lives in an apartment? Yeah, and do you guys see any electric vehicles in your parking lots? Couple, yeah. So it's, you know, it's still happening. the ability to access home charging may not necessarily be a total deal breaker to buy these electric vehicles. But it is an issue that people are thinking about pretty seriously. A lot of the utilities have these special deals and discounts for MUDs, which are multi-unit dwellings, essentially apartments. If you install them, you can almost get them installed for free if there are people who are living in your lot that have electric vehicles, right? And so there is some policy support already to try and make access for people who don't just live in homes more available. Yeah, so does policy support help? Yeah, buyers of used vehicles tend to have lower income. But when we look at used vehicle buyers for a lot of the electric vehicle market, they're still pretty wealthy. So what that means is, like, typically on average, you're gonna see, so if this was a gas car, the red line would typically be higher than the blue line, right? So people who buy new cars tend to be wealthier on average than people who buy used cars. But if we look at these axes, right, these people are making $200,000 a year. So they're used car buyers, but they're still pretty rich. Yeah, and so at some points, right, when we'll sort of even down here start to buy more electric vehicles. Okay. Yeah, one of the other things that they're trying to do, trying to provide this sort of holistic picture of support that's being provided to sort of level the playing field. Even things I've been involved with these committee meetings where they're talking about things like having accessibility at EV chargers with just credit card access, right? And so it's a big pain, actually, if you're an EV owner, if you want to charge in public. There are like a gazillion different types of charging network providers. And so you have to have an app for each one. You have to have a smartphone to be able to use them. And having a sort of more universal payment system, just having like a credit card reader, can be a simple way to improve accessibility. So, you know, the regulatory agencies are getting pretty down into the nitty-gritty details to try and improve accessibility for sort of potentially larger markets of EV owners in the future. Cool. Any questions? Great. Well, that is all I have for today. So before everyone takes off, just a quick note. Do this if you haven't. Do the poll for participation credit. The other thing is that I post additional readings for every lecture, which are optional, but if you are interested in, if you're particularly interested in any of the topics that come up during that lecture, you are welcome to read that. And then the last thing, if you didn't see the announcement, sorry, the recorded lecture from last time was a total fail. Apparently you can't use extension cords for webcams. So the whole picture is frozen, but the audio is still there. So you can follow along with the slides if you need to. All right, thanks everyone. I will see you guys next week.